Erin Reed is an independent journalist whose work can be seen in the Los Angeles Blade, The Guardian, and she was a digital director for the American Independent until 2021. She also writes a newsletter called Erin in the Morning. Erin specialises in LGBT legislation and has been described by the Associated Press as a prominent figure in the world of LGBTQ advocacy. For the next 30 minutes, we discuss the review on trans healthcare by Dr. Hilary Cass and whether this was a balanced, evidence-led report or something else entirely. Enjoy. Erin, welcome. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, as you well know, Dr. Cass released a review on trans healthcare in the UK. It's over 400 pages. It took her 4 years to complete it. I just want to ask, what's your initial response to the review? We'll get into the details in a moment, but what's your general reaction to this document?
Of course. So, the general reaction to the document is my same general reaction to the Florida review that was done here under Governor Ron DeSantis and a few other of these sort of very sort of targeted reviews that appear to be justifications to provide further crackdowns on trans care. My very quick initial impression was actually that the actual new data that came out of the CAS review does not support the strong claims that are made in this sort of more editorialized portion of it, where they discuss things in an editorialized fashion. Very, very quickly, for instance, you noticed, or I noticed that whenever they looked at gender clinics, they determined that they could only find 10 detransitioners out of 3,000 people who they had data on. And so much of what's in there is very similar to other attempts to basically look at the current journal articles and evidence and studies that are out there and to draw their own conclusion. And I want to be clear that this evidence is the same evidence that every single medical organization in the United States has looked at. It's the same evidence that the American Psychological Association has looked at, the largest psychological association in the world. It's the same evidence that the professional associations of transgender health have looked at. And they've all come to different conclusions. So, whatever conclusion that the CAS review came to, it had to do so using its own way of twisting that evidence to support a certain conclusion.
We certainly will get onto Ron DeSantis in a moment, because I think that's a really interesting link there. But reading the report or excerpts from the report, one of the most striking recommendations Cass makes is that healthcare for transgender people should be restricted to over 25s. Now, in the report, she talks about there being the need for a follow-through service aimed at 17 to 25-year-olds. So what does this mean in terms of restrictions for transgender children? And also, why this age of 25? I mean, why is it significant for Cass? I mean, we consider adults at 18. So, of course, many are going to find this quite peculiar.
That's a really good question. And I've been tracking state legislatures in the United States, as well as organizations in the UK, that have been building this case for a while now, that have been saying that the brain is not fully finished developing until the age of 25. It's something that you hear if you watch legislative hearings in the United States. You hear this from the people that are supporting bans on under 18 every single time that they speak. And so it's been clear that this was going to be the next target, that they were going to start to try to target people under the age of 25. And indeed, in the CAS review, we see the desire to segregate healthcare in such a way that people 18 to 25 do not move on to adult healthcare. And in fact, if you read the justification for that, it appears to be that there is some sort of discomfort with the idea that the wait times that transgender youth have racked up in the healthcare system in the UK will then get transferred into, or that it will count towards their wait times in adult care. So it seems clear that the idea is that they want to reset that clock. They want to make it so that those wait times do continue to potentially go up for this population. Now, we don't know what the 18 to 25-year-old follow-through service will have, but we do know that immediately after the CAS review was released, we saw a new inquiry announced into adult care in the United Kingdom. In places like Ohio, in the United States, we have seen attempts to institute bans on transgender care for ages up to around 25, as well as into the adult era, into the adult age range. And we've also seen attempts to crack down on that care by reducing who can provide that care. For instance, in Florida, they eliminated 80% of all adult trans care by banning all of our nurse practitioners from providing that care. And so, again, this is something that we are seeing as a potential um, next step in places like the UK, as well as in places like Florida, Ohio, Missouri, in the United States.
But she also references studies about girl toys and boy toys, to put it plainly. Typically, a boy will play with certain toys. She talks about trucks. Girls will play with dolls. And she referenced this as a biological factor. No, I mean, is she trying to say there can't be any inherent biological factor to transgenderism? Because when it comes down to it, what it seems what she's saying is your gender is wedded to sex. That's my interpretation. Now, of course, this review, much of the media, especially the British press, is supposed to be, unbiased, evidenced a report, but that's a very gender critical argument to be made. So, first of all, what do you think about this whole gender toy thing? And is she trying to conflate gender and sex?
I do believe so, and I also believe that this whole gender toy thing, it comes up multiple times in the review. It's a little bit baffling because it's not something that I have faced, and I've been covering this topic for 5 years. But it is the idea that there's a biological basis to what toys that we play with. There's a biological basis to what clothes we wear. We've even seen, for instance, in terms of games, we've seen the International Chess Organization, FIDE, announced that transgender women should not be able to compete in women's chess. Again, because of some sort of a biological basis behind competition in things like chess. And so it's, I think it's trying to build up this case that sex differences are immutable, that we cannot transgress these boundaries, and that transition is not something that should be supported. And that's what it is at the most fundamental level. It's the idea that, you know, girls and boys biologically assigned at birth are always that, and that biology is destiny, and that everything from the clothes that you wear to the toys that you play with to the games that you play is sort of determined by your birth circumstances.
Yeah, and I think on the surface, some people may overlook this, but again, fundamentally, it feels like to me the reason why she's using this example is to try and push this idea that identity and sex are the same thing. And by saying, well, if certain boys go for trucks and girls go for dolls, that means transgenderism is completely wrong. There's no biological basis. It feels like she's trying to eradicate transgenderism. Would you say that's kind of a bit too strong to say? Or do you think reading between the lines, this report is about trying to eradicate transgenderism?
There was a very famous statement made by a politician here in the United States, Michael Knowles, a political commentator, who
Yeah.
stood up in front of the Conservative Political Action Committee, the CPAC stage, and stated that the end goal for a just society is to eradicate transgenderism, quote unquote, at every level. And I don't know, I cannot say what is in Dr. Hilary Cass's mind. But what I can say is that the document that she produced is going to be used to attempt to do just that. And we already see it. We already see the banning of puberty blockers and hormone therapy in private clinics being announced. We already see the inquests into adult gender affirming care being announced in the United Kingdom. We see crackdowns being announced not just in the UK, but in the United States, where the very same organizations who are pushing the very eradication that you speak of, the people who share Michael Knowles' views, like the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Heritage Foundation, the Christian nationalist organizations in the United States that have written all of the anti-trans laws here, they have already shared the Cass review as justification for going further in what they're seeking to do. And these same people are the ones who were in charge in places like Florida of making sure that similar bans on transgender youth and adults go into place there. People like Patrick Hunter of the Catholic Medical Association, who specifically was tapped by Governor Ron DeSantis to ban care in Florida using exactly the same methodology, looking at the same evidence and coming to a preordained conclusion.
Yeah, so let's talk about Ron DeSantis. In your recent newsletter, you spoke about the connection between Cass and Ron DeSantis, not just because you also say that this Cass review, as you just said, and in your newsletter, that kind of emulates existing Florida reviews on trans healthcare. But can you tell me any more about this actual connection between the two people? What was the relationship between Dr. Cass and Ron DeSantis?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a sort of a fascinating story. Here in the United States, the legislature could not get across a gender affirming care ban in Florida. They couldn't pass it. It did not pass legally. And so Governor Ron DeSantis, who is widely known as one of the most transphobic politicians in the United States, he takes very hardline stances against transgender people. Um, Instead of trying again the next year, what he did was Florida has a board of medicine, I imagine similar to the NHS in the sense that they're authorities that cover healthcare. And so he essentially let go of several members of the Florida Board of Medicine and put in his own people. And these people immediately got to work on trying to ban gender affirming care. One of them was Patrick Hunter, who is a very notable Catholic Medical Association physician who opposes transgender care. And he enters into this medical board, and he's supposed to ostensibly, look at the evidence fairly and try to come to a conclusion around transgender care. Now, they ended up banning gender affirming care through the medical board, and a lawsuit that was filed has been uncovering documents from how that happened. And what this lawsuit uncovered, among many other things, is that before even starting their review of the evidence, they had a PowerPoint slide that said, we're going to review the evidence and then we're going to ban care. And so, it basically shows that they never intended to review evidence. Instead, they knew what they were going to do from the get-go. Now, another thing that was released from these lawsuits was communications with Dr. Hillary Cass, her team, and Patrick Hunter. And so we have these communications where they took meetings together, where they advised one another. And in fact, Dr. Keltiala, who I believe was also involved in some of the development or in advising of Dr. Cass, was then sent to Florida to essentially advocate for banning healthcare there and to give them sort of cover for what they were about to do. And that's all they needed. That they knew what they were going to do from the get-go. They just needed to provide cover. And so whenever we see these meetings between, Dr. Hillary Cass, who's this person who's supposed to be doing an independent review in the United Kingdom with very much handpicked Catholic Medical Association members in Florida who were there and under a lawsuit specifically around having a preordained conclusion on gender affirming care, it creates at least the appearance of impropriety. It creates the appearance that this was not a neutral reviewer or that this was not somebody who was looking at things with a very neutral eye. And so it worked. They banned care in Florida, and that care is currently under immense lawsuits here. Whenever I look at the report that Cass produced, it's very similar to the report that Florida produced. It uses the same rationale. It uses the same misinformation about trans care. It uses the same misreadings of decades-old studies to justify the case that it makes. And the conclusion, I think, and the result, I think, is likely going to also be the same.
So there's quite a big link here from the UK and the US. And for the last couple of years, it seems that the UK is very happy to take on the culture wars, which is imported from the US. Transphobia has completely exploded within the British media. Now, when I compare the UK and the US, I find something quite interesting. And it's no secret that the political debate in America is very biased to the right. I mean, it's the same for our country. Some of the policies and rhetoric from the GOP and Ron DeSantis, I think, are quite frankly fascist. Yet for the most part, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Democrats, at least in rhetoric, are willing to say they stand with trans people. It goes all the way up to Joe Biden. He's made statements in the past. Whereas over here, our so-called progressive party, Labour, have been adopting transphobic arguments, are unwilling to hold firm and at least make unequivocal pro-trans statements. And the soon-to-be health minister, Wes Streeting, because, Labour on course to win the next election, Wes Streeting said that he regrets that trans women, or saying that trans women are women and trans men are men. So it feels like there's much more of a polarization in the US where at least there's a section of the political landscape that is willing to at least sound progressive. Whereas over here, almost the entirety of the political establishment is happy to throw trans people under the bus. Do you agree with that assessment at all?
I do, and I think that it's a very interesting environment here in the United States where, you're right, I have covered over 1,000 bills in the United States, and the amount of Democrats that have voted for these bills, I could probably count on 2 hands, and we're talking in legislature after legislature after legislature, so we're talking among thousands of Democratic representatives across the United States at every level. And so, the Democratic Party in the United States has, at the very least, stood against anti-trans legislation for the various issues that they also have here. Meanwhile, the Republican Party has gone full steam on this. They are backing this with the degree that if you don't back it as a member of the Republican Party, you're likely to get primaried. Meanwhile, you're right. In the United Kingdom, it does seem to be different. It seems like you are dealing with a different breed of attack on transgender people. And while it's very openly Christian nationalist in the United States, in the UK, they like to hide those connections a little bit. They like to disguise those connections a bit. And so, here in the United States, I like to think that like we had this issue back in 2009, actually. Trans people went through this in the US in 2009. Our largest LGBT organization, the Human Rights Campaign, they, in trying to pass an employment non-discrimination law, they took out trans people from that law and they made it only gay people. And funnily enough, that law didn't even pass, but it caused an enormous schism and an enormous amount of anger towards what was then seen as like the liberal democratic establishment in the United States. Since then, 5 or 6 years later, HRC has apologized for that. And I think that at least our left leaning half of the country, has really moved forward to embrace trans people in a way that perhaps it seems like that has not happened in the UK. Now, I am, again, an American reporter. I do not know the intricacies of the political environment there around this topic. But that said, I do recognize the idea of throwing trans people under the bus for political capital. And that's something that we've seen that in the past in the United States. And we still see it sometimes in the United States to a lesser degree. And that does appear to be what's going on there.
I mean, it seems that in the US, of course, the GOP are trying to use this as political capital. And again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like that's not working for them. They're trying to push this culture wars, but a lot of people aren't responding. They want to respond more to material policies that improve their material conditions, right? Whereas over here, it feels like every politician has to now stick to a transphobic line because they're worried about losing votes. And it's not just to appeal to the conservative base. It is our Labour Party, the so-called democratic version in the UK. And I think that is, me personally think that is a result of our media. So even 5 years ago, the political landscape was pretty much, bygones be bygones, live how you like, whatever, do what you want. And there has been a huge shift in the growth in right-wing media, but there's a huge shift in the zeitgeist about transgender people. And then you'll know how one of our most famous authors, J.K. Rowling, is now really pushing hard on this, where even just a few years ago, she said she would stand in protest to support trans people. And now she's asking for forgiveness. Sorry, asking for an apology from Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson for being pro-trans. So it feels like there's a real market shift over here that may be quite different to the UK, the US. Do you see that drastic change?
I do. I do see it in the UK. And it's scary. I think it's scary for a lot of my friends out in the UK. I think that um, one of the things that we have in the US that I don't necessarily think that you have as much in the UK is if things get so bad in wherever we're at, whatever state we're in, we can seek out. It's hard for many people, and in some cases, extremely hard, but we can seek out another state where things are safer. And a good half of the country here is safer. In the UK, though, you're dealing with what seems to be a nationwide phenomenon, what seems to be something that is is growing. And I don't know what the answer is, but you're right. I've seen this sort of radicalization. It's like a mass radicalization process against transgender people. J.K. Rowling is a great example. It went from liking a couple tweets 4 years ago to then saying that J.K. Rowling has never said anything transphobic to now denying that trans people were targeted at all in the Holocaust, or denying that trans people have any right to exist as their chosen gender, denying legal documentation for trans people and more. And even even implying that trans people are rapists, even misgendering every trans person that she speaks about. I think that it's a scary environment in the UK. And I don't know what the answer is there. It seems like you're fighting such a such a toxic and hostile environment, not just from the people who are clearly going to oppose trans people, not just from your right wing, but also from a sort of liberal left wing that is trying to appeal to those same people.
Now, I want to talk about drugs. That has been one of the most talked about discussions when it comes to trans healthcare, especially children. Now,
Of
in the
course.
in the report, Cass believes, I mean, she references as gender medicine, as she puts it, is built on shaky grounds. And I want to get your response to that. I also want to get your response to those that say that they think that puberty blockers are dangerous and HRT is dangerous. What's your response?
Of course. So it's easy to say that trans care is built on shaky grounds whenever you throw out 101 studies that show that trans care works. And that's what was done. She's not the only one that's looked at this evidence. Her team is not the only one that's looked at this evidence. And many people have come to very different conclusions looking at the exact same evidence. The Virtually every major medical organization in the United States, we're talking the Endocrine Society, the American Medical Association, these organizations that have enormous impacts on medical care throughout the world, have looked at the same evidence and have determined that this care saves lives and that it's important. Study after study shows that trans people, they see improvements in mental health, they see decreases in suicide rates, and even Cass's own review that was commissioned says that there's moderate evidence that HRT can actually help transgender youth. Like, it specifically says that in the report. Uh, it then goes on to say, but it's not highest quality evidence, and so we should ban this care. Even the Cass report's own data supports that trans youth know who they are and that this evidence is good. For instance, again, out of 3,000 people that the Cass review looked, 3,000 transgender youth, they could only find 10 detransitioners. And it's important to note that this is a finding that is not unique to the Cass review. Just recently, out of Australia, they did a study where 658 of 662 people going to the only gender clinic in Western Australia continued to identify and go into adult care. And so, there's a lot of scaremongering on what medication does for trans youth. Puberty blockers, for instance, give transgender youth time to see if HRT is right for them. And whenever they do move on to hormone therapy, and the vast majority do because they are so accurately diagnosed and because transgender people do not detransition at high rates, this care has been shown to help them tremendously. As a trans person myself, and I think virtually every trans person you'll ever speak to about this can attest to how much our lives improved once we were able to embody ourselves and to obtain this care. And in banning this care, the effects are horrific. I can't even imagine what it's like to be a trans youth who has been on, gender affirming care, who has taken hormones and who's 17 years old and who now faces potentially getting that ripped away from them. It's horrifying to think of being a young trans girl who suddenly has to grow facial hair in front of their peers. And that's what this does. It's going to be extremely traumatizing to the transgender youth there. The last thing that I'll say on trans care is that, like all medical care, the best care is done individually between a doctor and their patients and done in accordance with what is working. We trust this with several other kinds of care. For instance, let's say that you're depressed and you go to a doctor and you get an antidepressant. That antidepressant might not work. So what do? They'll try another one. They'll adjust your dosage. They'll work with you to see what works for you, to see what improves you as an individual patient. And I think that that's maybe one of the biggest differences in how care tends to be accessed here in the United States, is that we do have a very high degree of respect for that part of the medical process, for the individualized relationship between you and your doctor. In the UK, it does seem like that is under attack. That very facet of medical care is under attack, not just for trans people, but for all people. And that's something that, I think bears concern in watching.
Well, that's interesting because the regret rate for knee surgery is actually higher than detransitioners because it's less than 1%. And the latest figures I saw in the UK is 6%. At least 6% of people regret their knee surgery. So if we were to, even the flimsy evidence that Cass used in a report, just using that as a standard for all other healthcare, there's going to be major problems here. So that's one thing that people don't seem to compare.
It's actually, I want to jump in on that because it's really interesting. The people who are allied to reports like the Cass report, the people that put out things like the WPATH files, they have looked at that piece of data and they have said that, oh, well, this is actually evidence against trans care because this says that trans people are suspiciously happy. That word was used. The phrase suspiciously happy was used in the Mike Schellenberger or WPATH files that were recently the big thing before the Cass review came out. And so it's important to note that this is unfalsifiable. This is something that you cannot. They're gonna take the evidence no matter what you say, and they're gonna make it out to be in the negative light. If the regret rate were high, they would say the regret rate is high. If the regret rate is low, they're gonna say they're suspiciously happy. If Cass had found a bunch of detransitioners, she would say the detransition rate is high. If Cass only found the 10 detransitioners that she found, she would say, oh, well, puberty blockers lock you in. So they're still not diagnosing trans care correctly. Whenever I say that they're coming into this with a preordained conclusion, that's exactly what I'm talking about. The evidence is there. It's the same evidence that everybody else has looked at. They are the ones that are deciding to look at this evidence and make claims about what they think it means. And what they think it means is whatever is best to make sure that trans care is banned. And that's what we're seeing.
And this is the big problem we have is the bleeding of political interference and so-called evidence coming into one. So many people who aren't that invested in it, don't research themselves, will think, well, this is a proper review and anything in it, I must take it at face value because there's a lot of assumptions in this report that are not cited. It is a propaganda game we're playing here because this could be, everything could be backed up by evidence and or nothing can be backed up by evidence, but the political fallout from it is really important. So do you see a big response to this? Are you seeing more and more people starting to rebut these some of these are fallacies, and do you envision maybe weeks, months down the line that we are going to see a big pushback from this, or are you worried about the impact this has already made and it's going to be very hard to fight against?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mention they're going to see people who don't know much are going to see this review and go, well, it's a review, and I guess it sounds reasonable. But those same people should ask why in the last 2 months we've seen the German Medical Association, the German Association of Medicine, just release a review that says that waiting is not a neutral option and that trans care should be provided for transgender youth. Or why the American Psychological Association just released a policy statement looking at the evidence stating that the same things that Cass says causes being trans, things like depression, anxiety, OCD, they specifically say, no, the evidence shows that it does not cause that and that gender affirming care is life saving. You know, politics and medicine have definitely intertwined. And in places like the UK, this is extremely apparent whenever you're essentially seeing the attempt to manufacture the consent to ban trans people from public life, to ban our medical care, to ban people from bathrooms and more. I do think that in the UK, this is going to be disastrous. I think that, it gives them that ability to try to make that claim using a local document that is unique to the United Kingdom. But this is not the first review that has been put out like this. Florida did the same thing. Meanwhile, other places have found the opposite when looking at the same evidence. Cornell University here in the United States, one of our most prestigious universities, put out a review of 50 studies showing that trans care saves lives. This matter is not going to be settled by a single report coming out in a single country. And the real fact of this is that it's going to end up being settled by politicians. It's going to be settled through political decision making. And as of right now, the political environment in the UK is such that the report is going to be used to justify, I think, things that we are going to look back on 10 years from now and be very sorrowful for. Um, but the UK is not the only player in this game. Again, Germany is going the exact opposite direction. I'm actually writing a story on this particular topic right now. Australia seems to be as well, and the United States certainly has been for a while. It's gonna be another arrow in their quiver, though, that they use to try to justify bans. And this is the fight. It's the fight not over evidence, it's the fight over politics. It's the fight over autonomy for transgender people to work with their doctors.
Completely agree with that. Now, Cass does talk about the lack of holistic healthcare, and there are some statements maybe that we wouldn't disagree with. There needs to be more investment. There needs to be more just awareness around trans healthcare. So, do you think there's anything worthwhile we could use in this report that could help young trans people?
I mean, certainly there were a few things that were extremely useful in the report. Things like the fact that trans care is good for at least some people. She admits it, that gender affirming care is good for at least some groups of people. It also shows that the wait times are extremely high and that the programs are swamped right now. Now, I disagree with her assessment as to why that's the case. She believes that there's this potentially mass social contagion or this upswing in being trans, whenever in reality, gender affirming care was gatekept so heavily, extremely so, to where it was almost inaccessible for years in the United Kingdom. We've only recently just started allowing people to come out and to be trans and allowing trans people in schools. We've only recently started seeing social acceptance of transgender people. And so, there are a number of things like that that will, I think, potentially be used in the future to justify um, good decision making. And again, I think like the evidence itself, whenever you strip out all of like of the editorialization and you just look at the new data that's provided, that part is gonna I'm gonna cite that. I'm gonna cite that very repeatedly. That even the cast review, the big cast review that's being used to ban trans care, could only find 10 detransitioners out of 3,000 people. Trans people know who we are. We're not just entering into transition willy-nilly and then jumping out. And I think that in the end, those bits of the review are going to be cited by people to say that even whenever you're trying to target trans people, the one thing that you will note is that trans people are happy. We know who we are. And whether or not it gets used that way in the immediate term, I don't think so, given the political reality there. But it could potentially be used that way in a more just world.
Is there anything you can say to young trans people who are feeling anxious, of course, from all of this? Is there any advice you have, given the hostile political environment here and in the US? What would you say to young people right now and young trans people right now?
I knew I was trans whenever I was young. I first identified as trans at 12 years old back in the 1990s. And it was not possible to transition back then as a transgender youth. Again, whenever we talk about the upswing in trans people, I was one of that upswing just because of the fact that I couldn't transition back then. It was impossible. And so I had to wait. I had to hold on. And it was very hard. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. For the trans youth that are in the UK, it's going to be very hard to wait. And if you have means to access care, through your family, through other means, speak to your doctors, speak to the people who, your LGBT organizations, your trans organizations, and find the avenues that are legal, find the avenues that you can obtain that care. And if you are forced to wait, it's difficult, but I waited and I'm still here. The trans community is such that, and the LGBTQ community is such that we have not only survived in the margins for a long time, but we have thrived in the margins. We have found our community. Find those people that are going to be there for you, that are going to stand up for you, and that are going to be in your corner. And you can get through this. And, we're working on building a world where our care is accessible, where our dignity is displayed to those around us and where we are allowed to exist in peace.
Well, Erin, I really appreciate you coming on Turner to speak with me. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.